Hello, my name is Rob Sandstrom. We're here to go through the process of creating a sign in the vectric software on your Laguna CNC. We'll start out by going through the design of the sign, then we'll transition into the cutting of the sign after we've designed it. Laguna provides VCarve Pro with their software. You'll notice that when we design the sign for this video, we'll be using a software called Aspire, which is also vectric. So for now, we're going to go into the design of our first sign using the VCarve Pro software. And once again, we'll come back after we've designed it and actually cut the project so you can see how that turns out. Today we're going to start a project with the sign. We're going to walk through like it's your first time actually creating a sign in vectric that will be then carved on your Laguna CNC machine. The place we start all projects is in the Create a New File. We click on Create New File and you'll see it brings up this menu. And this menu is the one where we're actually determining how the job's going to be put together. We can either do a single-sided, which means we're carving on one side. We can do a double-sided, which means we're going to carve the sign on two sides. Or if we had a rotary tool attached to our Laguna, we could actually do a rotary project. In this case, we're going to do a simple sign to start this first session. So we first have to decide how big we want to make the sign in our x-axis, which recall is the width of the material. So let's say we want to make this sign 10 by 18 inches, and we always make the width a little longer than we actually going to carve so that we have room for hold downs and other ways to deal with the project. In the end, we'll cut down the sign to the right length. So we're going to use a little bigger material to start out with. So we'll start out with a sign that's 24 inches long. So we'll leave the 12 inches. That gives us an inch on each side and basically an inch or 2 inches on each side. We'll be using 3/4 inch lumber, so we put 0.75 inches. Material surface is where we want to Z our bits. We could either do it off the surface of the material or we can do it off the bed of the machine. Typically, I like to do it off the material surface whenever I'm doing carving of a one-sided sign so that I know the depth of my carvings. We can talk in future videos about the selection for the bed. That primarily comes into play when we want to make sure the material thickness is consistent throughout the carving, or we're going to carve through and we're trying to avoid carving into our boiler. The next part of the activity that we want to look at is where our XY is going to 0. To try to make it easy for our sign location, I like to keep everything centered when I'm designing the sign. If you look at the screen, you'll see when I'm in 0, my XY 0, you can see is 0 here, 0 here. That's my XY datum point. If I change it to carving from the lower bottom left over in this corner, I select here, and you can see that would be, I would 0 my XY 0 at this point. And that's typically what I'll do when I cut. But for locating the sign and making the sign nice and consistent throughout, I typically like to go with the XY and the 0 when I'm starting out. Again, that'll be changed later. This modeling resolution really is not important, or the appearance not that critical when we are first setting up the material if we're not going to do 3D modeling. So standard fastest is going to be okay at this time. Hit OK. We now have our actual sign material. So this sitting here, as you can see, it's 12 inches left of the x-axis and 12 inches right of the x-axis and 6 inches above the y-axis and 6 inches below. So our sign was 12 by 24. That's our material. The next part of making the sign is determining what our actual sign is going to look like. I want to make a simple sign with some text and with a graphic to show you how you incorporate both of them. This sign is going to be one where we're carving into the wood. It's not going to stand proud at all. It's about the simplest sign you can make, typically done with D-bits. We'll be talking about tool paths later in the video. For now, let's plan on just making a simple, straightforward sign. To do that, we need to use text, vectors, other items that will come into play. Let's talk about different controls in this vectric software for creating your sign or your vectors. Everything's done in a vector. For right now, a vector is a shape. shape. Let's create our vectors from selections in this area right here where it says create vectors. That will allow us to create any vectors that we want. Start out with a rectangle, and we said we wanted this sign to be roughly 20 inches long by 10 inches, 11 inches wide. We'll call it 11 by 20. There's two ways to do this. You can see that we've got the anchor point here. If we want to have a square, we can simply hit square edges, or we can hit radius, comes around the outside in a circle, or we can radius on the internal. For this time, let's go ahead and hit square. We will change that later. We're going to want this to be 22 inches in the X direction, 11 inches. And then once we put that in, you see it's anchored in the center, so this will create the rectangle directly in the center. Had we anchored it in the bottom, then it would create it from the bottom. Let's anchor it in the center, hit create, and you'll see that the center, hit close. We'll see the center of this rectangle is located. Click on it twice to see the center handle. See, the center is located right on the XY datum center because that's where we located it. So that's good. That will give us the border of our sign. This is what we're going to cut to when we get done. The next thing we need to do is we need to put some text in this sign. It's a straightforward, simple sign, and I'm going to just use one set of text along with vector that I bought from somebody else off Etsy. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to put text. See, this icon here says draw text within a vector box. So we're going to click on that, and the box we're going to use is the one that we just created for the sign. So we said the bounding box dimensions were 22 by 11, and we are going to go ahead, select a font that we think will do what we want to do. Let's just go ahead with this Barlow Condensed. You can select any font you want and play around with it. And how about a sign that just says something like Gone Fishing? So we've got this Gone Fishing sign. It's placed it within the box here, and you can see that we've got our Gone Fishing. And there's our Gone Fishing. Well, now we've got it offset, which is okay. We might want it right back in the center. If we wanted it in the center, that gives us a chance to use our transform objects, and we can use our alignment tool. So if we select the thing that we want to align and we hit the alignment tool, we can see we would have different sections. So if I want to put it right in the center of the material, I hit click right there, and it will put it right in the center of the material. If I hit Control Z, which is what I just hit, or undo, that takes it back to where it was before. If I wanted to put it right in the center of this square, now that happens to be the same as the center of the material now, but if I wanted to put it right in the center of this square, I could actually then, now that I've got the Gone Fishing text, click on the square and then align selected objects to the last item. So the last item I selected was this box. So we're gonna, everything that I collected before that will be aligned to that, and we want that right in the center, and as you can see, it goes right in the center. So we've got that in the center. We hit close, click off the box, or we could have hit escape, and we've got our sign there. So, well, this sign looks kind of plain. How about a graphic? So we can add vectors a number of ways into this. We can either drag it in, or we can bring it in through the file. The easiest way is probably to come up to this location, and it says import vectors from a file into a current job. So we'll open this folder, and I earlier went out and I got a vector from a location on Etsy, which I paid a couple dollars for, and I got this vector that we located here, says fishing with a worm. So I'm going to go ahead and get this fishing with a worm vector right here, and I'm going to open that up, and you can see the vector. I'm going to take this vector so it moves together. The group together button is this button right here with the chain on it, locking it up together. So I'm going to lock it right there. That way I don't get things moving apart from each other. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to move that fish over to this part of the sign, and I want that fish to be a little bigger on my sign. So I'm going to go ahead and make it a little bigger, and that'll help make it look a little nicer when I'm carving. Okay, now I made it too big because you can see the worm is off there. So we're going to click on this again, and we're going to move it down. I think think I like it right there. And those of you that are watching go, wait a second, the gone fishing is now right in the middle of that sign. So we don't want that to happen. So what we're going to do is to resize the gone fishing part of the sign, and we'll bring it over here to the right a little bit. How about making it a little taller and bringing it down again in the center? Now the way to center this in the middle of this box is I can go ahead and click on it, and remember what I said about the alignment tool. The alignment tool over here, I click on that. Now if I click on the actual box I want to center it in, instead of centering it in the whole box, I can center it up and down. So I'm just going to center it this way, and you can see it moves slightly down. I'm also going to do the same thing with the fish. I'm going to click on it, I'm going to click on the box, and I'm going to center it up and down, and it didn't really move. I had already had it pretty much centered. So now we've got our text, and we've got our fish that we're going to carve into this sign. And the next part of creating this sign would be to go ahead and make a better border around this, because this is the outside. Recall, this is going to be what we said was the size of the outside border of the sign. So let's go ahead and put a little decorative border around the inside edge of this sign. I always like, maybe let's do a 1/2 inch inside of this rectangle here, and then we'll adjust the rest of the signage in the middle based on how that turns out. So don't worry if the actual vector that we're going to create, which is part of the border, actually ends up going over some of these words or this fish at this time. So we're going to go ahead and use another tool in the arsenal that Vectric gives us, and that's called an offset tool. If you go down here in the offset and layout section and you click on offset, you can see that what it does is it gives you a choice on whether you can offset it to the outside, the inside, or both. In this case, I'd say I want about a 1/2 inch border, so I'm going to put 0.5 inches, not 0.5, but 0.5 inches on the offside. And I'm going not to delete the original. I want the original to stay there. And then I'm actually going to just offset that outside by 0.5 inches. As you can see, it created this new vector. All right, that looks pretty good to me at this time. Now the other thing I like is I actually like I don't like that squareness, so I would like to have that vector actually have some nice radiused corners. So, you know, that's a preference. So how about going over to we've got it selected, we're going to go over to the rectangle, and since this is selected, you'll see it says apply versus new. And how about we're going to do radius internal corners, and I'm going to pick one to start out with, and let's see how that looks. So we're going to hit apply, and you'll see that now what we've got here is these radius corners. Now hit close, and that looks pretty good. Or if we wanted to make the outside corners of the actual sign radius, we could do the same thing. We could come in here, and there's a number of ways we could do it, but the easiest way is to go back. You'll see I selected that vector. I selected that vector and go back to the rectangle again, and we can do the radius internal again, hit apply, and now you'll see they're basically symmetrical as we're going to create the sign. That looks pretty good to me for right now, so we're going to hit close. Okay, that sign conveys what I want it to convey. So right now, I think we got a pretty good looking sign. We got a sign that's going to be saying "Gone Fishing." We've got this fish here showing off our graphic, and I think it looks pretty good. Now, what I do notice is, although "Gone Fishing" is a good ways away from the border graphic, you'll notice that on the fish, it's a little bit close to that border. So why don't we go ahead and make that fish by dragging the handle down just a little bit smaller, and we'll bring it over just a little bit this way. And then what we'll do is we'll go ahead and do that align object again. So we're going to align it in the center. We're going to click on this here, and we're going to align it up and down. Okay, that you can see now we've got the gone fishing text. Needs to move over just a little bit. This is a trial and error thing, and you can either drag it or you can use your left cursor on your keyboard, and we'll move that over a little bit. And again, this is all preference. So now we're going to move the fish over just a little bit. I think that's a good spacing for the two of them. And then I'm going to use the selection key by going left, down, and all the way around. And you'll notice I didn't quite get the upper loop of that fish, so we're going to collect on it by hitting the shift key. We're going to go ahead and we're going to put that in the center here, and we're going to center it in the middle of that rectangle. Oh, that didn't work. What happened? Well, what happened is that those are two different objects, and so each object individually is going to try to center, and that can be very frustrating. You may find that happen at times. To get out of that, all we have to do is undo that last stroke, and the shortcut for that is Control Z. I hit Control Z, and now you can see that things went back to what they were before I did the selection. So I'm going to hit Close here, and you say, okay, but I really do want to center that. How do I go about doing that? Well, here's how you go about doing it. You first click on the Gone Fishing text, then you hit the Shift key, and you click on the grouped fish there. Remember, we grouped it before, and we go ahead and group those together again. That means the dynamic of that fishing and that vector are going to stay the same throughout the process. So now we've got those grouped together. Now if we click on the alignment key, I click on the rectangle and I hit center, you'll notice that it's perfectly centered. We were pretty much centered already, so you didn't see it move. So now we've got a sign that's set up pretty well, and we'll be able to carve it. It's once I have this all aligned, it's a good idea to ungroup. So the first grouping I did was these two, so now you'll see that they're no longer grouped. I select this one, it's by itself. I select this one here, it's also by itself. You also remember that I grouped this one originally, and the vectors may not work as designed if you're because you can't select individual vectors when you're setting up the toolpath this way. So good now to go ungroup that set of vectors, and you can tell it's ungrouped because now when you click on each vector, it's a different vector. So now we're at a point where we've got the sign designed, which is the first phase, and if we go look at the different parts of the sign, we'll go ahead and look and we'll see that the outside here, this section here, this is the actual material that we're going to be carving into. These are the vectors that we're going to be setting up to carve the sign out of. So this is actually the size of the sign if you look at this outside. And this will be decorative on the inside. You'll see what I'm talking about in a few minutes. And we've got our text, and we're ready to set up the toolpath to allow us to go ahead and move forward and carve the sign. Let's talk about how we want to set up this sign. Typically with a sign like this, we would use a V-bit toolpath to actually carve the letters and the fish profile. The first thing that we want to carve is let's carve the gone fishing. Now we could carve the gone fishing and the fish profile together, but the first and easiest is the gone fishing. So let's talk about how we're going to set up. Recall that a V-bit is going to carve everything inside between two vectors, and if you have multiple vectors, it will have to choose where it carves and where it doesn't. So in this case, we want to carve the just gone fishing part of the sign. And in our sign, we're going to make that at the most an 1/8 of an inch deep. And so the way we're going to do that is we're going to select the right V-bit, and we're also going to put a flat toolpath. And I'll show you what happens if you don't. So let's start out with a VCarve toolpath, and we're going to go through the discussion of each. Now, if I pick the gone fishing, that's the vector that it's going to carve inside of using the V-bit. And let's say I decide I want to use a really fine V-bit that I use for details. You would not want to use that kind of V-bit typically in this type of application. I use this a lot more for, that's when we get into the fish and we have very small vectors. We can talk about that. But, so I would typically use a bigger bit, but I want to kind of show you what would happen if I used this bit and I tried to, because this might be an error you'd find, and I tried to use it in this application. So let's just say this is a 15-degree bit. It's a very, very sharp angle. So what it wants to do is go down until the top of the bit is made the width, and if it doesn't, then it'll keep going down. And so what do you think is going to happen? Well, let's look. We're going to All right, we're going to go ahead and calculate this without a flat depth. So we're going to take out the flat depth and calculate it and see what kind of error message it gives us. As you can see, because that bit isn't wide enough at the top to ever fill the whole gap, it tells me it's going to keep going down and it will eventually go through the base of my material. So that's not going to work. We don't really want to cut through the material. We just want to go 1/8 of an inch deep. So I'm going to cancel this. And then let's see what happens if I go in and I put a flat depth of 0.125. Now we'll calculate this same sign. We hit calculate. And we can see that the gone fishing by the preview, that's the tool path you see going here, is going to be inside of, it will cover, and it'll go down to 1/8 of an inch deep. Now let's take a look at what that looks like. We'll find that we don't really think that's a very efficient tool path, and we're going to want to modify that. But let's take a look at what it looks like if we do a preview. So what we're going to do is we're going to preview a visible tool path, which this is checked so it's visible, and see what that looks like. So you can see the bit is actually carving, and we'll get a result, but it's not the cleanest result, and furthermore, it's going to take a longer time because of the tip is trying to clear all this material out, that little tiny tip. So to make it easier to see, let's go ahead and change that toolpath color to a color that's easy for us to see. So I typically like to use black or dark blue. We'll just go ahead and use dark blue at this time. And that is where the carving is going to be. Obviously, the actual tool is color of the material is the color, but if you want to design a sign, you can pick your toolpath colors and be able to see what that's going to look like. So you can see what that is going to do. Now, that's obviously not a very efficient methodology, so let's edit that. So I click on the VCarve 2 toolpath, and I hit Edit, and I still want to go a flat depth of 0.125. Let's say I want the ends very sharp, so I still like that V-bit for the ends. I probably would pick a different one, but at this point, we're just going to use the same one to show how it works. And then we hit the clearance tools, and we select a tool that will actually fit inside of that gone fishing. And because we can tell what size these letters are, we'll pick a tool that will fit in there. And you're going to pick an end mill, a flat end mill. I'm going to pick a 1/8 inch end mill. And I'm going to select that tool, and you have other, and I'm going to go ahead and use that end mill to do most of the clearing of this material. Gone fishing, so I know which one that tool path is, and I would typically I like to put in bits that I use, but for now there will be 2 paths generated. So now, this was the old tool path that before we ever did anything. I'm going to take that out of the picture. You can see when I modified that tool path before with a separate clearance path, now there are 2 tool paths generated for that V-bit. And so they will actually cut in a different manner. So let's go ahead and look at how each one cuts. We're going to reset this profile. And the first one I'm going to leave as the color of the material just so you can see what it looks like. And we're going to preview that toolpath. Let's slow it down just a little bit so it's easy to see. And you'll watch the cursor over here. Ready? Here we go. See the toolbit moving? So it's going in and carving out with that 1/8 inch flat end mill the actual letters of the sign. Okay, it's completed. Now you can see what it's carved. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to give that a color by coming up here. See how it's highlighted here? I'm going to come up here and I'm going to give that toolpath a color. Let's just give that yellow so we can see the contrast. So now we're going to do the final touch of using that V-bit, which will basically go around the outside edge of all of this. And we'll preview what that looks like. You can see how it's going around the edge profiles to give us that V-bit profile. And it's done. So this bit went around the outside edges, and that's where it finished up. So the end result is a nice flat carving of gone fishing without much depth. Now let me take and see if I can show you. Can you see that? If we look at it now from a side, you can see how it's carved into the material down 1/8 of an inch or 0.125 inches. That's what the sign is going to look like without the color. We can remove the color if we wanted to, but again, I like the color in there to show what it looks like. If we want to go back to the sign itself, I just hit the Z key and it brings me back into the front of it. So now we're back. All right, now we want to talk about changing those V-bits. So let's change our V-bit. So I right-click on either one of these and I hit Edit. And now I'm back on the V-bit, and I like to go back to the 2D view because I'm picking vectors and so forth. So the 2D view, come up to the upper left corner, click on 2D view, and you're back to 2. If you hit your scroll mouse, you can move your sign around, which is what I did right there. So I just like to look at it different. So let's see what happens if we were to pick a bigger V-bit. And we're going to take out the flat depth, and I'm going to select a V-bit that's not unusual for signs. I'm going to select a 90-degree V-bit. So I've got a 90-degree V-bit that's right here. I'm going to use that V-bit, and I'm going to select that as the V-bit that I want to use. I'm not going to use a clearance tool the first time, and we're going to see what that looks like as we use that V-bit to carve the same sign. Now we're using the same words. We haven't changed anything. All we've done is change the bit. I'm trying to demonstrate how the bits react and why it's important to get to know how they're going to react and how to use your preview fashion. So we'll hit Calculate. Okay, we can see the depth of the carve by a little display that's down here in the right-hand corner. So look right down over here to the right, just below my arrow over here. I don't want to go too far, the taskbar is going to come up. You can see the X, Y, and Z. When I'm scrolling over this, you see the Z is at 0.0000. Look at what happens when I go right over the carving. So you can see now it's telling me how deep this carving actually is from the Z, which happens to be the surface of the material. And you can see this actually carved in 0.2 inches deep, so it's pretty deep into the wood. a third of the 7.75 inches of the wood almost. So if you like that, then that'll be a good carving, and you don't need to do anything else. But if you do want to keep it, say, an 1/8 of an inch deep, how do we do that? Well, we're going to come over and we're going to edit the gone fishing part again, and we're going to hit the flat depth, and we're going to go into 0.125 inches and select the same V-bit. We've not done anything else. Let's use a clearance tool this time. Let's use that 1/8 inch clearance tool we used before. So we're going to select an end mill, which is flat. We're going to select a 1/8 inch end mill. It has this profile right here. Select it, and then we will recalculate. And if we're paying attention from before, recall we will now end up with 2 tool paths. See, we've got a clearance tool path, and that's being done by the 1/8 inch end mill, flat. And then we've got the other tool path, which is the V-groove tool path. So let's run those now. We're going to hit Reset Preview. We're going to run both tool paths. And you can see the difference. The clearance path, okay, we're going to carve this up, turn this up, and you can see now that we're 0.125 inches deep is the deepest we've gone. How can I tell? Well, I scroll over this section. If I look back down in that lower right-hand corner, you can see it says 0.125 inches. The only thing I used to color code on the toolpath was the actual V-bit, so you can see what it is. It's went along the outside, so that's a V texture. A lot of people like that versus a straight down texture, and that works out really well for giving you a nice sign that you can then paint this letter. If I wanted to see what it looked like all blue, I can come over to the clearance toolpath now, and I can come up to the toolpath color up here, give it the same color as I gave the other toolpath, and now you can see what it looks like, and you can see it's an 1/8 of an inch deep. Let's scroll over that again. We want to get back to what it looks like up front. We can go ahead and turn the tool around, and that's what it looks like, which is a nice looking sign that we have so far on the gone fishing part. Okay, the next tool path I want to talk about is the fish. Let's look at how we want to do that. We're going to take this back to the 2D view by going up to the top left corner, clicking on that. I like to put it in the center just because I like to work with that. And so we're going to look at the fish, and I'm going to go ahead and select the fish vectors. So I can either select them ahead of time, or I can select them after I select the tool path. So I've selected the tool path. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to pick the vectors the V-bit carving on. Now this is a more complex design, and that's why I wanted it. You can see there's a vector, a closed vector inside of a vector here. So there's multiple vectors, and there's several different vectors all included here. It's not just one vector. So let's just, to see what it looks like, go ahead and select the whole fish and hook and line to see what that'll look like. If we just carved it the way with the VCarve, we won't use a clearance tool at this time. We'll go ahead and keep it at 0.125 inches so it doesn't go too deep, and we'll go ahead and calculate what the fish is going to look like. Let me call this fish over here. All right, you can see the tool path, what it says it's going to do. We're going to hit Preview Visible. And that's what this fish is going to look like if you just pick all those vectors. Let's go ahead and color this fish with a toolpath color. Let's just pick black. And so when you get done carving with your 90-degree V-bit, this is what it's going to look like. Let's turn it on the side so you can see the carving. And I'd say that looks like a pretty nice graphic. You simply paint inside those lines and you've got yourself a nice graphic. Let's blow up so you can see how deep it's going. Starts to get pixely when you get too deep, but you can see how deep it's going in here and here and here. And if that's deep enough for you to get your paint in and then do a sanding so that you don't get the bleed on the material, that'll work just great. Now, if you needed to make this a little deeper, there are some techniques that you can use to do that. You'll notice the hook and tie here. What's gone on with that is because that tie was a separate vector. Let me get to the 2D view and show you in a minute. But so the VCarve is carved around that and left that proud, just like it left the lips proud. Let me go back to the 2D and show you what I'm looking at. So in that hook, you can see this section right here. This is going to be proud. So the VCarve is going to carve all the way around that and leave that proud. And the same thing with this piece and this lip here. So it's calculated out how it's going to go about carving this. So this is what our sign looks like at this time. I'll hit the Z button up here to bring it face view. And I think that sign looks pretty good. Now we need to cut out the rest of the sign. And if we wanted to change the material, by the way, let's say we were going to do this on a light pine or some other small material. Let's change this material to pine. This is what it would look like, say, on a pine material sign. Or if we wanted to do something like MDF, it's not usually attractive, but you can do the sign on MDF. Or you could even use some kind of oak. All you can see, all I'm doing is selecting the different types of wood that are pre-programmed to give you a view of how that might look. We'll move on to our next tool path. So I'm going over the 2D view. And so now what we have is we have these two gone fishing. Now we need to carve the outside of the sign, and we put this decorative barrier in here. So one way to do that, and it's typical, is we'll use a V-bit profile cut. What's that mean? Well, what that means is I'm going to use a V-bit to do this cut versus an end mill. So let's go ahead and we're going to do a profile toolpath, which means I'm going to pick a start depth like I did before. I'm going to pick a cut depth like I did before. And so I'm going to need to say how deep I want that bit to go. So let's say I want that bit to go initially 0.125 inches, which is 1/8 of an inch deep. I'm going to start at the top. I'm not going to use an end mill because I'm trying to use this technique to put a border picture around. So I'm going to select here. Out of my tools, I'm going to pick a V-bit. So I picked the V-bit and I like the 90-degree V-bit I used before. I'm going to select that bit. And then what I need to do is I want to say I want to be on the profile, because that means the V-bit, the tip of that V-bit is going to go down right inside of here. Now, if I did it on the outside, the tip of the V-bit would go on the outside. If I did it on the inside, it would go on the inside. I'll go ahead and use a conventional cut. I don't want any allowance offset. I don't need a separate last pass. I'm not cutting through the material. I'll go ahead and ramp it in so it doesn't just jam in there at first. Let's go ahead and give it 0.25 inches, which means the bit will go down in and slowly move into it. And we don't need to project anything on the toolpath, so we're going to calculate that. And now what we have is an outside decorative border. At least that's what it should be. So I'm going to go ahead and cut that profile, and let's see what it looks like. So you can see how that looks now. Not too bad, I don't think. I always like to give it a color just simply because it helps me picture what it's going to look like. We'll give it a black. And so that's what the profile is going to look like. Let's turn it sideways so you can see the depth. So far it's looking pretty good. Then the next thing we want to do is actually, so I'm just going to give this a name, rename this to border profile, so I know what that is. We'll go back to Z, and then I'm going to go ahead and select that 2D view, and we need to do the last thing, which is basically cutting out the sign so we have a finished sign. So let's do that. What we do for that toolpath is, once again, we hit this profile toolpath. We want to go to the bottom of the sign, and there's a couple ways. If we wrote down what the bottom of the sign was when we started, it happens to be 0.75 inches, we can simply put in 0.75 inches, but that works. The other way is, if you haven't kept track of how deep the actual sign was, you could simply enter Z. Z means that it's going to go down to the depth of Z, and Z was defined by the material thickness. So if I put Z there, then that means whatever Z is, that's how deep it's going to be. In this case, it's 0.75 inches. I can tell that by putting an equal sign here, and you can see it says 0.75 inches. But I like to have it, in case I change the material thickness at a later date, I don't like to have it tied to a specific number. So I always like to put Z, which tells me it's going to go down into the material the exact height of Z. And I don't mind scratching my spoiler board a little bit. A lot of people, that really bothers them, but I'd rather cut through. So I will typically put in a clearance path. So if I put in Z plus 0.01, that means it's going to go down to Z plus 1/100th of an inch. And so, or 10,000ths of an inch. So I typically will use that for my cut depth when I'm cutting out a profile. Obviously, we can't use a 90-degree V-bit, or it would have the funkiest kind of cut you can imagine. If you don't understand what I mean, drop me a line and I'll share that with you. But what we're going to do is, we're going to select now an end mill, an appropriate end mill to cut it out. And most of the times I will use a 1/4 inch end mill, and there's different versions. We can get into all this discussion. You have a compression, which will give you the cleanest cut, but most people don't spend the money on a compression bit. And honestly, I find that a little sanding, unless you're using like plywood, that's a whole different story. But if you're using some kind of wood, solid wood, a downcut bit works just fine. So you'll need to make sure of a couple things. One is that the bit is long enough to cover the whole material. And so I'm going to pick a 1/4 inch end mill. And I need to pick the outside border, not the inside border. I just realized the inside border was picked. Pick the outside border. I want a 1/4 inch end mill. This is telling me that it's going to take 6 passes. The reason I've got that 6 passes is that I've got this end mill cutting at a pass depth of 0.125. If that was more aggressive, let's just take an example, and depending on the size of your machine, it can be. Let's say I wanted that pass depth, which is how deep it cuts on each pass, 0.25. You can see it changed it to 3 passes. For this, I'll go ahead and leave it at that. But typically, I will keep it at 1/8 of an inch on my machine. I'm going to go on the outside of this vector, which means I want to get this full border effect between the outside and the inside line. So I'm going to cut on the outside of this. I don't need to leave an allowance, but to show you how it works, I'll go ahead and put an allowance of 0.02. And what that will do is allow it to cut on the outside here and leave 0.02 inches. And then I'll do a separate last pass, and I'm not going to leave any allowance for the last pass, which means it's going to come in and actually cut the material all the way. A lot of people like to use it in a reverse direction. They think it provides a cleaner cut. Experiment with that and see what you think. The next step is to add tabs to the toolpath, because unless you're going to glue this whole thing down with like double-sided tape or something else, you can do that, and that works just fine. A lot of people like that. Or if you're going to hold it down and just want the material to stay down, a lot of people like to use tabs. So I'm going to add tabs because that's my preferred methodology. We'll make the tabs just a 1/4 inch long, and we'll make them just about an 1/8 inch thick, which means that once we're done, the tabs will be in place, and we'll go in and we'll cut them. We're going to edit those tabs, and you can see we can move a tab around. We can take it out, or we can add it. I like the tabs where they are. Try to keep them away from the edges and the corners, and we're going to head and say we like that, so we're going to close that. I like to add a ramp to my toolpath. I don't like to just plunge, so typically it's 2 times the diameter. My toolpath is a 1/4 inch toolpath, so I'll usually put 0.5 inches. What that means is it's going to come down in, it's going to ramp in instead of going plunging, kind of more gentle. I think I've got it out there, so I'm going to say outside profile, which tells me that I'm going to cut along the outside. Let's calculate. Now what it's telling me is, hey, this thing is going to cut all the way through the material. Do you realize that? And depending on how far you went through, it could hurt your spoiler board or your machine bed. Do you really want that? And I do. I knew it was going to do that. So I say yes. Now let's preview what that's going to look like when we're done. Okay, this is what it looks like. You can see the tabs we added. You see the tabs here, 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 and here. So when we're done with the sign, let's turn it to the side here. This is what the sign looks like. Gone fishing. We have these tabs. We'll have to come in with a flush cut saw or another saw and cut these tabs off and then sand them down, and we'll have a nice looking sign. Now, some people like to see what the sign's going to actually look like without all the border. They don't like the clutter to see this. Let's go ahead. I'm going to put this back to the Z view, bring that up, and let's do another cut for giggles. We're going to go back to 2D view, and I'm going to add another profile cut. So I'm going to go back to profile, and I could have just changed that one, but so I don't get confused, I'm going to hit Z plus 0.01 like we did before. I'm going to go ahead and let the bit use the same bit. I'm going to then take the outside profile. Notice I'm not changing anything on this cutting profile. I'm not going to add tabs this time as a thing. I'm going to go ahead and add a ramp. I'm not really going to use this cut because I'm going to keep the tabs, but I want to see what it's going to look like. So I hit calculate, hit OK. It tells me it's going to go through. And now I'm going to rerun this profile cut, and I want to rename it because I don't want to get confused later. Outside profile, no tabs. I don't need to actually run any of the other cuts because they haven't changed. And I'm going to now run this profile, preview the visible toolpath. It's running, and you can see that the tabs aren't there anymore. So what it did was it ran the same profile, but it took off the tabs. What that allows me to do now is if I double click on this outside section that's waste, it will actually go away, and that's what my sign is going to look like. Okay, now we know what our sign's going to look like, and it's time to go get our wood and get ready to start cutting the sign. Well, as I went and got the wood to start cutting the sign, I found out that I didn't have a piece of wood that was exactly the size of the sign. If you recall, the wood that we set up, the material we set up, was 24 inches wide by 12 inches long, which would have fit on the Laguna IQ perfectly across the width, the x-axis and the y-axis. But the wood I found out there was 29 inches long and 9.5 inches wide. So I decided, well, let's take an opportunity to show how we can change the project around so that you don't have to start from scratch. So we're going to do that at this point in this tutorial. So the first thing we want to do is we recognize that the wood is 29 inches long. We have two opportunities. We could either cut the material down to 24 inches, but we can't extend it to a 12, or we can change the direction of the wood. So let's start by changing the direction of the wood. We're actually going to make the X direction be the new dimension, which is 9.5 inches wide. We're going to take the Y direction, which fits up to 36 inches on Laguna IQ, and we're going to put that in at 20 8.5 inches, which is the length of the piece of wood. The next thing we're going to do is, the wood was not 3/4 of an inch thick, but it was 7/16 of an inch thick. So we can do the math, or we can let the program do the math for us. We'll just put 7 divided by 16 and hit the equal sign, and the math is done for us, and that tells us that this sign is now going to be 9.5 inches wide, 28.5 inches long, and 7/16 or 0.4375 inches wide. We also said at the end we'd cut by going on the bottom left part of the x-axis now that we've got the sign designed. So we're going to go ahead and select the XY datum point down to the bottom left now that we're getting ready to actually do the setup for the final cut. So now that we're set there, we're going to hit OK. Changing any of these settings means all toolpaths. Well, we changed from what one might call landscape to portrait mode, up and down, vertical, and we know that all of that's going to change, so we're going to have to go ahead and hit yes. There's going to be even more changes. It says the toolpath will exceed the material thickness. We know that. Remember, we had the Z plus 0.01. And one thing you'll notice is, look, the sign itself, now the material is in a different direction than the sign. Let's go to the 2D view. And that's to be expected because we designed it originally in this direction. So how do we go about shifting the sign to fit on this new piece of wood? It's pretty straightforward, but it's a couple steps that we'll want to look at. First thing we're going to do is we're going to open up the Toolpaths tab. I'm going to lock it so that we can see it, and I'm going to take off all the toolpaths that we had already defined so that I don't have this noise on this sign. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead, and do you remember the group function from the beginning? I'm going to group all this together so that it moves at the same time together, and I'll ungroup it again later. So we hit group, and then what we can do is we can actually rotate this sign now so that it will fit in the same direction, which is cutting up and down. Remember, our XY axis now is down here in the lower left. So the way to rotate is two ways. One is you can select the rotate and rotate in a direction and put in there 90 degrees in that angle relative to where we are now, and you hit apply. I'm going to hit Control Z to take it back, or the other key is you can hit the 9 key. If you just hit the 9 key, it will rotate at 45 degrees for each move. Now this is located in the center of the material, but just to make sure, we're going to click on this and we'll see it's all grouped again. Remember, we haven't ungrouped it yet, and we're going to do the alignment. So we want to do an alignment to the center of the material. So we clicked on the center of the material, nothing moved because it was already aligned. Now the next challenge is this sign is just a little bit too wide at this point. So we can take care of that by going ahead now and shrinking the sign such that it fits in this direction. So the best way to do that is keep it grouped. Come over to the resize function under transform objects. We're in the resize function, select object size. We know that the width of this sign, the material, is 9.5 inches. We would like to have some material around it to hold the material in when we start cutting it for the tabs. So the easiest way to do that at this point is to change the X direction, and we will go ahead, instead of making it current width of 11 inches, we'll make that sign, let's say 8.5 inches. Now, if I leave the length XY selected here, that means it will automatically change the Y direction at the same time to keep everything into perspective. So I hit apply. So now we can see the sign will fit in the dimensions, or the spacing we originally had on the sign is still intact. Hit close, and now we have a sign that fits in the material, the new material that we got. It's only 7/16 inch thick. It's 28.5 inches long by 9.5 inches wide. We're carving in the up and down direction because we didn't want to cut the board down to the original 24 inches to fit on the Laguna IQ in the X direction because it has plenty of room in the Y direction. And we're set now to continue on with the rest of the process. So the first thing, by the way, that's an advantage because it gives us more hold down area at the top and the bottom. All right, so the next thing we want to do is start being able to build the tool pass or recalculate the tool pass. So the first thing we'll do is we'll ungroup. Recall we grouped these two things together. Now that we've ungrouped, you have to ungroup to allow the tool pass to recalculate. So we're now going to click on this button and get the tool pass selected over here. And recall we had all of these tool paths. If we click on any one of the tool paths and we say recalculate, and then we come over here and we say recalculate all, that will now recalculate all the tool paths using the original parameters. And it's telling us the tool cutting depth will exceed the 0.438 inches. Remember, when we cut the outside profile, we went Z, and so when we changed the thickness from 0.75 inches to 7/16 of an inch, it knows we did that, and it's telling us this material will cut through at that amount. Hit OK. Let's go back to the outside profile just to validate that. We're going to click on that. We click right, click on there, hit edit, and you can see it's Z plus 0.01. So it's going to go 0.01 above the thickness of the material. We're going to close that out because everything else looks good. We can use all the same tool paths. And now what we want to do is we want to preview all the tool paths. So what I did there was I clicked on the preview ball button, and we're going to go ahead and just say preview all tool paths to see how this sign's going to look. All right, still looks pretty good. If you want to take a look at it, if you prefer looking at it in the sideways direction, remember you can simply rotate the sign around by holding the shift key and moving it around in the 3D mode. And that's what the sign's going to look like now. Same sign, just a little bit smaller. You can see the carving in depth. You can see how everything looks. Looks pretty good. So the next phase is to go ahead and transfer our tool path now to a USB so that we can run the machine. Okay, we defined our tool paths, and now it's time to be ready to cut our sign. We have to take those tool paths and put them on a USB drive and transfer them to the Laguna machine. So we'll take like bits. We have two types of bits. We actually have 3 bits. We have a V bit, a 90-degree V bit in this machine, in this sign. We have a 1/8 inch end mill for clearance of the gone fishing, and we have a 1/4 inch end mill to actually cut out the edge of this sign. So we're going to do the V bit first. That's my preference. So we've got gone fishing, the fish, and the border profile all use the same 90-degree V bit. We will select the save feature. You can see they're all the same bit. We make sure we've got the right post processor. For me, it's a Laguna IQ. For others, it might be a different Laguna or a different machine altogether. We hit save toolpath, and we select the USB drive that we want to save it to. I like to name it by the tool so I know what it is. So it's going to be my first cut, and it's my 45704 tool, and I will save that. The next tool that I will use is my 1/8 inch end mill for the sign. I'll save that, and that's my 2-46225. Again, it's preference on how you want to save your tools. That's how I do mine. And the last tool that I need to save is my outside profile, which will be my final cut with the tabs. I'll save that as three-tack down cut, DNC. 250 is my abbreviation for that, and I'll save that bit. Okay, now that I've got my tool paths all saved, I can pull my USB port and take it to the machine to actually carve. One last thing, if you want to get a guess on how long it's going to take to carve, the easiest way to do that is to select all your tool paths. I did that by clicking this button right here, this check off. Go up to your summary of tool paths, and this will give you an estimate about how long the sign will take, not counting how long it takes you to change your bits. We have 3 bit changes in this, and so you can see this sign, as currently designed, will only take 18 minutes to actually carve. It will probably take you more time to actually paint it and sand it. Okay, we've now designed the sign, and we're going to come out and cut the sign on the Laguna IQ. We'll be using Laguna IQ today for making this sign. We'll start out today by setting up the material so that it's fastened to the spoiler board. There are several different ways to do that. Today we're going to be using a pretty simple methodology with these small clamps, because we've allowed enough room on each side of the sign to be able to hold it down without the bit coming in contact with it. That's the one thing you want to look at when you're setting up your material. So at this moment, we're going to go ahead and fasten the material down, and then from there, we'll go ahead, turn on the machine, and we'll set things up to actually do the cut. So for now, let's just fasten the material down. What I like to do is make sure that's a nice square edge, and because we're actually going to cut the border, it's not critical that the material be completely square, but pretty close, because the CNC will cut the material square when we're done. We know that we have at least 4 inches, 2 to 4 inches on each side of the sign that we're going to cut. We're going to cut the sign in this direction, the Y direction. So we've got room to put these clamps down. So we'll start out with 1 clamp here on the front. We'll put another clamp on each side. Here we go. Looks like I'm going to need a couple more clamps. So one thing I want to point out, this is not going to be exactly square. It's going to be close. We'll do a trial run on this before we actually make the cut, just to make sure that our tolerances fit within the sign, but it shouldn't be a problem. One other thing I'll point out about the hold down of this project is that if you remember the cut, we're only going to have a slight amount of border here. So we wouldn't want to put clamps over the actual area of the sign on the sides here, because if we did, then we'd end up having the bit hit the clamp, and that's never a fun thing when you're doing that. Okay, we've now got our material clamped nice and tight. It's not going to go anywhere. The next phase of the process will actually turn on the machine, put in the USB port that has the G-code built for the machine, and then start to run the job. All right, now that we've got the material secured, you can see this stuff isn't going anywhere. So we don't have to worry about it spinning off the bit. Everything's nice and snug. The next step is to turn on the machine, home it, and then set up the XY0 data point for the machine to know where we're cutting from. So the first thing we want to do is to turn on the Laguna IQ. As it's turning on, you'll notice that it's going through different phases. It says auto scaling, and the first thing it'll come up with is a screen that says all access home. It's critical every time that you turn on this Laguna IQ, that's the first thing you do, is you go to the all access home. To do that, we hit the origin OK button, and that will take us to the home location for the machine. What you'll notice is that it will move out beyond the edge of the spoiler board. That's what's expected. Okay, you can see the machine is now homed, and that's what I was talking about. The home position, here's the end of the spoiler board. Here's where the machine's homing. The nice thing about that with the Laguna IQ, not discussed today, and we can discuss in later videos, is the fact this allows you to do joinery, such as dovetail joints, box joints, and other things, as you fasten the material to the edge of the machine. So you've got this much room to actually do joinery if ever needed. The next step we'll do is we'll actually, let me close this for a minute, and we're going to actually take this machine and we're going to go over to the home position, the XY data position for the job we're going to set up. One thing to recall is that this, after at home, defaulted to the #1 position. The Laguna IQ has 9 different preset positions you can put into it. So that's one of the things to pay attention to, is make sure that you're going to the preset position that you want. In this case, we're going to start out by going to the home position for #1, and we'll find that that's probably not where we want to home this machine, because we've just now put the material down in a different location. But we'll start by going there to see what that position is. So at this point, I'm going to hit OK. It's going to tell me, do you want to return to the origin? That's the origin for position 1. I hit OK, and the machine will now go to that origin location. As we can see, that origin location is located right here. But where's our material? Our material is over in this area. So now the next step is to make sure that we're actually going to have our XY data start point be at this location. Now we can reset the XY0 for the #1 position, but if we wanted to set it up specially so we could repeat it all the time, we could pick a different position. The way we would pick a different position is we'd hold the menu key, and then we'd press a different position. And now you'll see this says 2X, 2Y, 2Z. So now we can reset the 0, and that'll be our #2 position. And whenever we want to set the material back in the same location, we'll know it's already zeroed. For now, let's go ahead and 0 it in the 2 position. So the first thing that we're going to do, let me set this machine, oh, I need this controller, is to locate the 0 point right here. To do that, what I like to do is use a pointed bit, such as a V bit. So we're going to remove this bit from the machine, and we're going to place it with a pointed bit, which I have, and that's the first bit we're going to cut with anyway, and that will allow us to get a better alignment here on this point. So the first thing I'm going to do is, I don't want this hanging over the edge in case I drop this bit. I don't want it breaking or hitting the sidewalk or anything else. I'm going to move the bit over in the X direction. You can see by hitting X plus, I've moved it to the right. And now I'm going to go ahead and take this bit out of the spindle. Okay, we're now at the point where we want to change out the bit, and we're going to put a V bit in to make it easier to line here. It so happens that the V bit is also the first bit we're going to cut when we cut the sign. So it's always a good practice when we're putting in or taking out bits to have a small piece of soft material such as styrofoam, so that if the bit drops as we loosen it, they have a tendency to drop. It will not end up hitting into the hardness of the spoiler board, or even bouncing off the spoiler board and then ending up on the ground, which can damage your bits. And these bits get very expensive if you damage them. So the first thing we're going to do is put the bit up on the top, locate it there. What I like to do to stop from smashing my hands here, there's lots of times you're going to find that you get sore knuckles if you're not careful. So you notice how I've got this so that I can actually grip the two with one hand. That gives me extra strength. Keep my fingers out of there. And then I can easily open it without smashing my fingers. It's your preference. You can do it however you want, but that's something I've learned over the last several years, is to keep my fingers out of the way of fire. So we're not going to need this bit. What we're going to do now is we're going to insert the V bit. When you look at your bits, you'll notice there's something on each bit. I don't know if you want to zoom in on this. There's a little mark here. That mark is the mark of how deep you should insert your bit to ensure that it's securely held in the collet. All manufacturers put a little mark on how deep. So we know that we want to put this V bit in to this depth. So I typically will put my thumb there, and then I'll locate it to that point. Now I know it's deep enough so that we're not going to get chatter, break the bit, and have a secure fit for this bit. So now that I've got that snugged in there, I go ahead and I tighten the bit down. And once again, I typically like to have it so that now I'm going to be closing it this way within one hand. I can pull it together like I'm pinching a pair of pliers, and I've got it nice and snug. I can remove the styrofoam because I can't drop the bit anymore. The next step on this process then is to go ahead and zero the bit in the XY location. So right now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to move, using this controller with the X and the Y, I'm going to move this bit right over the corner there, so that tip is centered on this XY axis. So let's go do that. It's all done by eye. All right, now I'm lowering the Z so that I can get it as close as possible, being careful not to hit these brackets. That's the one thing I don't like about those brackets. So now when I get close here, I can hit the high-low, and that will slow down how fast the spindle is moving X, Y, Z direction. Give me a little more fine-tuned control. Instead of 5 millimeters per second, it's going to move 1 millimeter for each button push. You can see how it says low SP. So now that we're close, I'm zeroing it down, and I'm taking a look at the bit. And you can see we're pretty close there. Once we've got it located, we go to the XY0 button, which is number 4, and we hold that down, and that will put our 0 point for this position, number 2, at this location for this job. As you can see, 2X and 2Y have gone to 0. We will be zeroing our Z in a few minutes. I'm now raising it so I can move the bit around, and I can go to high-low again so it moves faster. Can you see the difference in the speed? And I'm going to move this slightly out of the way because it will start, when we start the job, it will go to the right location. So the next point I want to do is zero the Z height. To zero the Z height, I pick the location of where the cutting is going to be. I can pick anywhere on here. If you recall, I'm moving it to this direction. The sign will be mostly in the center. So I'm going to move it to the center location. And I can use my zero puck. So a couple things I want to check when I'm using this zero puck. Number 1 is I want to check to make sure that this clip is in and hasn't accidentally fallen out. That happens on occasion. So make sure that that clip is located in the side of the box. The next thing I want to do is locate the puck directly under where the bit is going to come down, and I'll start driving the bit down. So I'm doing that by hitting the Z minus key. Z minus is bringing the bit down. Now that I'm getting close, the next thing I want to do is allow this thing to come down slowly, touch the puck, and then return. So the way you do that is you hit the menu on key at the same time. Now, when I do that, you will see that the bit will start to go down on its own travel, and when it touches the probe, it will return, and that will tell you you're at your Z location. One thing you'll see me do, I'm going to give you that heads up right now before it happens in the video so that you know it's coming, is I will test this bit to make sure that the connection is good and there's not a broken wire between the puck and this location even though it's here. Because if I don't, and it doesn't see this bit electronically, then that bit can actually drive right through the zero puck, which is never a fun day for anyone. So we're going to go ahead and start that. I'm going to start by, let me get on this side of the bit. I'm going to start by hitting the menu on button, and you can see how it's coming down. So the first thing I do is I touch the bit. Now, I touched it, probably a double touch, but at least we know the wire is connected. We'll try this one more time. Okay, now I've got the bit zeroed off the top, which is what the software program, that's what we said we were going to do, is a Z off the top. We've got the material Z'd off the corner, and we're ready to insert the USB and prepare for the cut. Okay, now we're at a point in the process where we've got the material held down, we've got the machine zeroed out at the XY axis, and we've also zeroed the bit at the Z-axis for this first cut. Remember, you're going to have to zero the Z-axis every time you change the bit. So our first cut is using this V-bit. We now have the program located inside this USB drive that we saved from VCarve Pro. We'll locate the bit inside the controller. It takes a little minute for it to read. Once it's read, what we're going to do is hit the Run Pause button, and you'll see this menu item come that says U-disk file. That's what we're going to run off of. We're going to run off this disk. That's the U-disk. Hit OK. I put it in a folder called Fishing. Hit OK there. And then the bit that we decided we were going to use is this 145704, named after the bit that I have in there, which is a V-bit. Number 45704, that allows me to keep track of which bits and when I want to run them. So this will be a V-bit toolpath. When I'm ready to start the machine, the first thing I'm going to do, all I have to do now is hit OK, and that will start the toolpath. Before I do that, I'm going to turn on the dust collection, then I'll come back and I'll press the OK button to start the toolpath. Okay, our first pass is done where we were cutting with the V-bit. You'll remember when we designed this sign in the software that we used a clearance path with that V-cut. And that clearance path is primarily going to focus on the area inside of these letters to make them a nice flat look profile. in between the V cuts. So the next step in this process is going to be actually changing this bit out for that clearance bit, which is a 1/8 inch end mill. And once we get that changed out, then we can go ahead and start the next pass. So let's go ahead and change that bit. Notice I put the protective styrofoam down. We start with a bit. I locate this such that I can get a squeeze on it, like we talked about before, so I don't hurt my fingers. Take this bit out, and we replace this bit with a new 1/8 inch end mill, 46225, 1/4 inch shank, but 1/8 inch cut. Once again, I locate where it needs to be cut. Right now, it needs to be that deep. I put my thumb there, locate it under there, hold it in, snug it down. Make it so I can squeeze the two together. Nice and snug. Take the styrofoam out. We'll now move the bit to the center or close to it. It doesn't have to be, just anywhere in here. We'll re-zero now. Remember, in between each bit change, after you change the bit, you have to zero the bit again. So this time, we'll zero the bit. I'm checking to make sure this is connected. It's connected. I bring the puck underneath the bit, start it down, hit the menu on, it starts its direction down, hits the puck, and now we're zeroed. The next step will be to go ahead and run the path. Okay, now you remember, when we designed this, we used the clearance path as I just talked about. If you look closely, you'll see there's ridges inside of these letters. We wanted that to be nice and flat so that when we paint the sign, it's going to stand out for us. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to use that 1/8 inch end mill, and we'll clear out these paths. That's what that clearance pass is about. And that's what we're getting ready to do. When we get all done, we'll show you the difference. This will be nice and clear and flat. Okay, our next step is to run that clearance pass. So we hit the run pause button. We hit the U-disc like we did before. We pick the fishing sign, a fishing folder like we did before. And now we're on the second toolpath. Remember, I called it 2-tack 46225. I'm going to go ahead and turn on the vacuum, and then I'll hit the run button. Or the OK button. Okay, notice the difference. Now it's all cleared out in this area, so there's not little raised areas in the middle of the letters. It's nice and flat. Everything should paint up real nice. Do a little cleanup with a brush and some sandpaper. Here, some kind of brush like this. Go into the letters, clean them up. Same thing over here. Go into this area where the bit has been cutting and just kind of brush things out, make it nice and clean, and you'll have a nice carved sign. Okay, now we're on the final pass, and that's where we'll run that third pass. If we hit select, fishing again, and the third pass is the down cut bit. That's the one where we're actually going to cut through the material. First thing I have to do though is change the bit. One thing I wanted to point out is the other thing that you may not notice is while the machine is running and cutting, I'm typically wearing my not typically, I am wearing my safety glasses. I'm off camera at that point. So for any of you that were wondering about safety glasses, yes, you should be wearing them whenever you're running your machine. While you're doing these bit changes and everything's static, it's okay. So next point is we're going to change out bits, which means I'm going to run the machine back down into this area. And change the bit. Okay, the bit has been zeroed, everything's set up, ready to run. The next part of the project will be for me to select that tool path, turn on the vacuum cleaner, and then hit OK to get it running. So we're going to select the tool path. It's number 3. And then I like to watch it as it's coming through. Okay, I'm pretty happy with that sign. The next step is we're going to go ahead and cut these tabs. All right, to separate the sign from the actual material, I simply take a flush trim saw, which is one that's got plenty of blades, and I like to just cut down right next to the tab. And you can see the tabs cut, and we'll do the same thing for all the tabs all around it, and then we'll clean off the little onion skin on the back and sand it. So as we discussed at the start of this video, this was a simple sign project where we did some 2D carving, where the letters and the border and the graphics were just carved into the wood for a nice, simple, but elegant look. We went through the process of designing this in the vectric software. This same process that we went through for this sign could be used on a number of other types of projects, such as cutting boards, charcuterie boards, or other things that take simple carving techniques. Your imagination is all that limits you. This is the first in a series of videos that we're putting on to try to provide you information on how best to use the vectric software and Laguna CNC combination. So this project is a simple, straightforward project. The next project we're going to be doing is we'll make this same sign, Gone Fishing sign, but we're going to show you how to change that around a little bit so that it's not just a carve-in fashion. It looks almost 3D, where the letters, Gone Fishing, are up in the air. They're pocketed behind, and the same with the fish design. So it'll give you the same concept of a sign, but a little different look for how you can design a sign that looks like it's 3D. Stay tuned for that. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to make those, and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. And be sure to subscribe so that you can get updates on future projects.